Power of She is USISPF's newest podcast series where we showcase the brilliance of women professionals across an eclectic mix of industry and amplify the voices of inspiring women in leadership, riveting dialogues, and candid conversations to uncover her story. We intend to go beyond the boardroom and perhaps to the virtual drawing room where we can have intimate, heartfelt conversation focused on getting to know the person beyond the persona. My guest today raises the bar. That metaphor has never been more apt because I'm delighted to be in conversation with Mrs. Zia Mody, one of India's foremost corporate lawyers and attorneys, and co-founder and managing partner of AZB Partners. Of her many accolades, Zia is widely acknowledged for her expertise, ranking number one in Fortune India's 50 most powerful women in business list in 2018 and 2019. Zia, so thank you so much for chatting with us, and welcome to the Power of She.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me over. I'm delighted to be part of this podcast.
Pleasure's all mine. So, Zia, let's do the Julie Andrews school of thought. Start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. You mentioned, when you were young in Bombay, leading a normal middle class life and wanting to get married, your mother put you on a plane and sent you abroad to study. This is a very fascinating story when I heard it because this touches on a few paradoxes. One, at a time when back then the conventional norm in patriarchal societies was to settle down and marry for young women, your mother was against it and instead of you going abroad, insist on you going abroad. And two is when she sent you abroad at a time when people perhaps focused on sending their sons. So just go back to that time. What was a young Zia Mody's vision that time, and how did this story shape up to who you are today?
So I think it stems from the fact that my mother and all my siblings are by religion Baha'is. And one of the cardinal 10 commandments, if you like, of our religion is that men and women are equal. My brothers always tease me to say, remember, it's equal, not less equal for men. But therefore, I think that we were brought up by my mother, who was obviously in command and control of our upbringing, in a way that there was no differentiator between genders. And since I was the eldest, my mother, who always complained that since she got married at 17, she lost the chance to win the Nobel laureate in physics, was determined to see that her girl child did the best for herself. So I wanted to marry my childhood sweetheart at that time, who I am married to today. But my mother just felt that, that would just not let me further my career and my studies and my profession. And therefore, she put me on the plane the minute I announced that I would like to get married and sent me off to study law abroad. I always wanted to do law, not necessarily abroad. And so I think that after that, there were multiple excuses on her part not to let me return. I first did my basic law degree, then my master's, then she made me work. Well, I worked for 4 to 5 years in a New York law firm. Then I finally came back. And in the meantime, my poor father, who was a well-known lawyer, barrister, he was very keen that my brother, the second sibling, also be a lawyer. But my mother decided that one lawyer was enough in the family. So she said, you go be a doctor. So poor guy became a doctor. Good doctor, but not a lawyer. And so I think that, the expectation of wanting to do well, to make her proud, to make my father proud, to be successful, was really my driver when I returned and even while I was away. And so that really propelled the passion into the journey of law for me. And it has stayed that way even though I am 68 now.
No, absolutely. I was just thinking about when I first heard the story. It sounded like the British Indian series "Goodness Gracious Me" when we had to spoof. And I want to get to you touched on a few things about your father, and as someone from Bombay, my father told me a lot about Mr. Sorabjee and bless his soul wherever it is. Taking you back to your childhood a little bit, or your younger days rather. You say you went to Cambridge Law and Harvard Law School. Law runs in the family, in the blood, as you mentioned with your father. being the legendary late Mr. Soli Sorabjee. And I think he wore many hats, from a leading lawyer, Supreme Court lawyer, a jurist, human rights activist, the former Attorney General of the country, a Vibhushan winner. But I think the one that he'd be most proud of, because my dad's most proud of this as well, is their jazz connoisseurs and aficionados. So with such a towering presence that we've seen in the public sphere, what was he like at home? What was the father that he was like?
I think he was loving enough, but absent minded. He was so caught up in his cases day to day. And after a while, Papa was really in Delhi Monday to Friday and only back home for the weekends because he was busy in the Supreme Court. I think he was very indulgent. I was his princess. I was the only girl. I was the eldest. He used to love pulling my hair even when I had three children. He used to call me Bilari, which is a Parsi nickname for pussycat. So affectionate enough, I think left all the bringing up to my mother, was confident that she would give us the value system that the family should have. But I think that he earlier was very happy when I was coming back to Bombay and arguing as a barrister in the Indian courts as a junior counsel. He wanted me to be known, to make my name visible, to argue matters, to be heard by the judges. And I think he was very disappointed when I morphed into a corporate M&A lawyer until much later when he heard many people saying I was doing reasonably well. And then he finally sort of grudgingly became proud of me in my new avatar. But if Papa had his way, I would have gone on to become a judge. And I think that he felt that I had let his system down. But I think and because he was in Delhi, it was good and bad. Good because I was not overshadowed by his presence in Bombay, where I practiced. Bad because I never really got the full blast of mentorship that I could have
Mm.
got if I was sitting next to him. But he was always a phone call away in terms of guidance, in terms of strategy. Not often, but whenever I needed it, he was always there. So growing up with a father like him was daunting. I never started to be competitive with him ever. I knew my place. But I enjoyed the homilies, the stories, the small tips that he would give me about how to make sure the judges respected me and always thought that I would never be anything but honest. Taught me about when to sit down and shut up when the judge was with me and not to make a complication of a case that I was otherwise winning. So it was a good relationship.
I was just reading about some of the what you've said about your father. Like, Mr. Sorabji always said, never lie to a judge. The judges all eat lunch together. Never, you can, you never lie in front of court, and always come prepared to court. So it just seemed like someone, when you said absent-minded, just my vision was almost someone who was so immaculate and so precise as the legal profession would demand. You
Absent-minded,
mentioned
I think, on the dining table
that par
because
for
his
the
mind
course.
was always on the next day's cases. So he
Mm,
would be talking into that, what we used to have, that walkie talkie at that time, taking instructions from his solicitors, giving instructions to his solicitors, us hearing one side of his conversation on the dining table, which was just fascinating in that sense. And therefore, how was your day? Was not, really waiting for the answer for how was your day. It was just the question, how was your day? And I remember when letters were still exchanged and we didn't have emails and mobiles, he used to write me a very loving birthday letter every year, but the age would always be left blank, and that would be filled up by my mother in a different
mm.
handwriting. So, Papa was Papa.
No, I can imagine. While we're still talking about your father, I remember reading, uh, about the how he was such a champion of free speech and human rights, and defended many such large cases in the Supreme Court and even with the UN. I'm sure during the time as emergency, of course, which uh, I have a journalist grandfather, and that really influenced him during emergency. But when Mr. Sorabji was advocating for a lot of time for political descendants, what was your memory of that time as emergency, both when you were seeing it as well as seeing your father in action during the time? Because that really, in the 77 years of India, that's really shaped India, and many would call it as the one time the dark days of Indian democracy.
So, at that time when emergency was declared, I was actually abroad studying stroke working. But my brother, who was in Bombay, used to tell me how every day there would be a habeas corpus writ to produce somebody who had been arrested without cause. And
Mm,
how my father used to be in court every day virtually. And of course, the family at home was worried about his own safety in that sense. And so those were very tense times. And I just remember a call of absolute joy that I got when I was in New York when my father said the emergency is over.
mm.
Because I think it riled up so many people and gutted their intestines in so many ways. It was instinctively not anyone's ability to accept a country that was not a democracy.
You mentioned about abroad, and I wanted to go to that because you began your career as in the New York office of Baker McKinsey, if I'm not mistaken, and you said you were there working for 5 years. It was a time when immigration from India in the 1970s, the emergency era happened, the India Pakistan war happened. India was still a socialist. Even no one was talking about the India story that we're talking about now, and you were living the M&A dream in Manhattan, New York, a place where the world wanted to move to. But at that time, if I'm not mistaken, 28 yourself, what made your 28-year-old self want to come back to India and leave the American dream and bet on a horse that wouldn't bet on itself at that point?
My husband,
To be succinct. um, you know what? So when you came back here, there were obviously the pangs of settling in. As we touched on, it was not a globalized India. You mentioned there were hardly any women in your profession, and even the ones that were sort of uh, overcast. They were shadowed. They had to be reticent and subservient to the male counterparts. So, how did you find your voice at a time when such a demeanor was not encouraged and maybe even frowned upon for young female lawyers?
as I said, that is how we grew up on the dining table, right? A noisy, equal family. So my sense of confidence was not in any way slanted by my gender. On
Mm,
the contrary, I felt that I had to prove very much that I was equal to the 99 men in the court, being the only woman. And I think the sequitur of that is I was always over prepared, if you like,
mm,
completely paranoid, worked much more than my male counterparts by and large.
yeah.
And it was the only way to get a voice and be heard and be taken seriously, especially because in those days, law was considered a marriage degree. You went for 3 years to law school till you got married, and the marriage was, something that you had to wait for. So you might as well do something in the process. But for me, that was never the case. I remember my father telling me that you must pray for one thing every day before you go to sleep,
Mm.
and that is the next day your senior is sick so that you can argue the matter. And so you must be so ready when you go to court the next day that you are ready to just take off and say, my senior is not there, I will open the case. And that's how I really lived my junior life, waiting for the opportunity to open my voice.
You mentioned about your upbringing and the Baha'i faith, which has been very important and very sacrosanct in the parity between men and women. But give us a deeper worldview into that, because a lot of people may not have come across people of the Baha'i faith, and so it's very fascinating to understand this from that. Because in my experience, people as from Bombay, but people outside have not even come across people from the Zoroastrian faith. So someone from the Baha'i faith is even more rare. So please just let how much has that still continues to play a part in
Sure.
your life today?
Sure. So it's very much a part of our daily lives. My father was not a Baha'i, he was a Zoroastrian. We are all Parsis by race,
Mm,
but by religion, he was Zoroastrian, and my mother was a Baha'i, and Baha'i going back 4 generations. So we were the
mm,
fifth generation of children, if you like. Were so.
mm,
What is a Baha'i? So Baha'i is one who follows the prophet called Baha'u'llah, and he was. We believe the latest but not the last in the line of prophets. We believe in the theory of progressive revelation of religion, that God sends down messengers from time to time
Mm,
to reinforce the spiritual message, which has to be equal, but is adapted to the social times of that century. So
mm,
if I'm a Baha'i and I don't believe in Jesus Christ, I cannot be a Baha'i. If I do not believe in Krishna, I cannot be a Baha'i.
yeah,
So we believe that all the prophets came from the same source. That our prophet Baha'u'llah is the latest, but he has himself said he is not the last and will never be the last. Because God sends teachers to the world every now and then. So we all follow a book. Our book is called the Book of Laws. You can liken the emergence of the Baha'i faith from Judaism to Christianity. So
yeah.
just like Christ was born a Jew and proclaimed Christianity, Baha'u'llah was born a Muslim and proclaimed the Baha'i faith.
Mm,
And today our most holy place is where he is buried, which is in Akka, which is now Israel, which was then Palestine, and before that Turkey. And that's where we go for our pilgrimage. We have no priests. We believe in one God. We pray in the language we understand. We have no rituals other than a two-liner for marriage, and we bury our dead. So for me, it's a very modern religion in the sense that the teachings of our prophet are actually still exist. Nobody can
mm,
mutilate them. They are written in pen and paper. They are translated into everything. And so for it was very appealing to me as something that I could understand rather than learn by rote or follow only by custom. And so we all became Baha'is, myself and all my brothers.
yeah. You can see the principles till today. Even though this religion is from days of yore, but its contemporary values are still very much there.
Correct.
I wanted to speak about the legal profession a little, and your lessons in leadership, because let's start with the big picture. You're the lawyer of a very you're the daughter of a very eminent lawyer. And if you look at the founding leaders of this country, right, from Mr. Gandhi to Mr. Nehru, Sardar Patel, Mr. Ambedkar, who drafted the Constitution, all eminent lawyers and phenomenal legal minds. Even in the U.S., Washington aside, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, all legal minds. There are plenty of professions that produce outstanding individuals, but yet there is something about the secret sauce of the legal profession that produces such perspicacious thinkers. If I had a penny for every time Harvard Law School produced a president. So, what is it about the legal profession, say over say medicine or engineering or so many other professions, that produces such thinkers far ahead of its time?
I think, in fairness, great doctors have also been thinking ahead of their time. I think lawyers are a analytical breed, very logical as they need to be, understand how to dissect and navigate and solve nitty problems. And so I think that the jurisprudence which the great judges have developed have been a wonderful combination of following the rule of the law as well as the spirit. And so the best lawyers are really the greatest jurists.
Yeah.
And that is what has shaped our constitution and our legal status in the world community. Today, if you look at South Africa, Pakistan, they follow Indian cases. They
Mm,
follow our Supreme Court. They very much not follow. So South Africa gives a lot of respect. We give a lot of respect to the UK, to Australia, to the US. So there's a committee of jurisprudence of which Indian lawyers and judges are an integral part. And I think it's because of our ability to think deeply, not be superficial. I think as lawyers, every
mm.
profession has shining stars, not just lawyers. We've had some great lawyers that will be remembered hopefully forever. But I mean, you have great doctors, you have great accountants. We just like our own as lawyers, I guess.
Yes, but especially 'cause I think it's just an asymmetry of lawyers being part of, just in corporate in national level leadership. It's been fascinating. I wanted to get your perspective on some of the leadership lessons that you shared. You said mentioned once being a good leader is not just having a good IQ intelligence quotient, which of course is important, but having good emotional quotient. In your many years of being part of corporate India, corporate law, and working closely with top business houses, do you get a sense that right now the Overton window has changed, that business leaders now acknowledge more of their shortcomings? Because EQ for me is not just about learning, but it's also about unlearning some of the things that you've done to and having the humility to learn more. Do you see that it's changed from your time for starting off in your early days in the legal profession to where you're at now?
Yeah, most definitely. Absolutely. Earlier, businessmen did not like being given a negative answer. It was a
Mm,
can do sort of system that they favored. I think with the law that has developed, the regulators that have come in, shown their hand at controlling behavior and not accepting bad behavior, I think that businessmen and businesswomen have realized they don't want to be on the front page for the wrong reasons.
mhm,
Reputation has become much more important. And to be seen to be governed well is equally important from a valuation perspective. So behavior has definitely changed.
mhm,
I think, as my mother always says, it's the fear of God. She said, if you fear God, it's a good thing. Don't worry. You don't have to love Him. You fear Him first, then you love Him. So again, it's the fear of being caught or the fear of being highlighted with the spotlight in your eyes that started the trend towards thinking, is it really worth it? And
mhm.
is it not worth it to pay a price monetarily for not doing maybe as well, but in the long run to have a reputation where ultimately people want to invest in you? It's like the house, I mean, the Tatas, right? The minute you
Mm.
mention their name, the second adjective is good governance, right?
Yeah.
Why? It's taken centuries to build up, but they've been at it and they've not let
Mm.
themselves down. And so when everyone wants to get that reputation, that's when behavior starts to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw the words of both condolence and respect that came from Mr. Ratan Tata. Bless his soul again.
Absolutely.
Ethics with excellence, right from JRD Tata to Mr. Ratan Tata, and that's
Absolutely.
the Tata brand as well, with Mr. Chandras carrying forward as well. Um,
Absolutely.
I,
Chandra as well.
yeah, absolutely. So just wanted to stay on the context of IQ EQ because it's very fascinating for me because at a time when you were growing up in India and there's there's definitely a push towards more of the STEM and the applied sciences. Um, as a top M&A lawyer and sticking to the facts and getting into the minutia and the legal expertise, that I would assume takes up your left side of the brain with some of the number crunching, cold hard decisions that have to be made. And that's the way M&A has been seen, especially in the New York corporate law scene. And we can thank Suits for giving us that reputation. But EQ also means a lot of empathy, the right side of the brain. And balancing a sense of both fiscal pragmatism that you have to do while running a top law firm, but with a softer touch of empathy of the person on the other side. So, how do you go about doing this?
It's not always easy, but I think it comes more naturally, sorry to say, to women than to men.
Mm.
I think
I
that,
believe it.
just look for what makes people tick, what makes people sad, what makes people anxious, what makes people
Mm,
happy, and try and balance the EQ that everyone wants to receive, right? You don't just work for money, you work for affection, you work for respect, you give your loyalty to people who you believe leaders are loyal to you. And so I think that a large part of my week
mm.
goes into just people. And I
Mm.
think that is probably the most important part of my job.
Yeah, you mentioned you've taken risks in the past. You've taken the plunge going abroad, taken the plunge coming back. You took the own plunge in your own entrepreneurial journey as well. Started off with the Chambers of Zia Mody, which is now AZB Partners, I think in 2004. So happy 2 decades. But tell us about this own journey, the entrepreneurial journey, the then getting together with your managing partners. And from what I see, it's more than a firm. It's sort of a family where there is a sense of uh, you know camaraderie that really drives the secret sauce of the firm. And this is an outsider looking in, so would love the actual perspective so on the journey.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I think we were more of a family when we were smaller. We're now over 700 lawyers, so it's difficult to be as sticky as you were when you were 12, which is what
Mm.
we started out as.
Big
Uh,
joint family now.
yeah, the journey has been, rewarding. We started off with 12 and then we grew. And then I was joined by my partner Behram, who is the B in the AZB in
Mm,
2002. And then my partner, my co-founder and managing partner Ajay Behel, the A, joined us from Delhi in 2004, which is when it became AZB.
mm,
And we were much, much smaller then. Just knew that we liked to work together and we had each other's back. And we had the same value system and we had the same obsession for quality.
mm,
And then, we grew as India grew. We added more offices. We were first only Bombay, Bangalore, Delhi. Then we added Pune. Then we added Chennai. Bangalore became a big hub for us for our VC work, etc., etc.
yeah,
And so today, are we the largest in the top tier firms? Absolutely not.
mm,
Do I want to be the largest? Absolutely not. We want to be nimble, ruthlessly obsessive about our letterhead, completely quality driven, and have a set of clients that value us and we value them.
right. That took me by surprise. Do you want to be the largest? Absolutely not, because most people say absolutely yes. So that's thank you for that. You touched on the India story little, and I wanted to get into that because good governance is something you said when the India you returned to was not known for. Public service at that time did not have the same clarion call as it did in the United States. The post Vietnam era, and in sometimes politician was codified with grift and corruption that was back in the day. But the India that you've seen has changed is not just in the private sector, it's also been in the public sector. So you've your firm has grown when India has grown, but how have you seen India grow from the public service, given you deal a lot with bureaucrats and Supreme Court and the league ministries at the highest level. So how have you seen the India growth story at the public service?
I think all good. I think that the bureaucracy is the one that has to perform for India to shine and grow. Politicians and ministers come and go in that sense, but the bureaucrats have to stay firm to the agenda of growth. And what I found was over my journey really wonderfully surprising is the excellence and caliber of our good bureaucrats and
Mm,
how they can really shape and make a path for India to actually blow away the cobwebs and get into the modern world. You have a few good bureaucrats you can, swirl. It's that way. The power they have, the way they can navigate the system. My interactions over the years with the regulators have been only growing more positive. Of course, there are pain points that everybody has, and I think the poor regulators are not spared of hearing about the pain points, as they should be. They should hear about the
mm,
pain points of the rest of the industry and the
mm,
private world. I think there is a much more sense of willing to listen than there was before. There is less of a closed mind that every businessman is a crook. People don't think
mm,
like that. There is an openness to see how we can attract the world together to come to India. We believe in India now as a bureaucracy and as a political party in whichever center or state. And so everybody's aligned with this vision of, India has to grow, India has not met its potential. And it's a combined journey. I think as private sector, all we need and are often given is a little sense of encouragement from the government. Don't forget, the sectors that have done the best have been unregulated. So when regulation comes in, it has to come in sensibly. And if there are pain points, they have to be removed sensibly.
Right. And, Zia, the part of having such a fascinating conversation is you kind of answer my next question, but you also take me down to, oh, I want to ask you about this because, I was reading a very fascinating article about, a lot of how the bureaucracy looked at businessmen, as you rightly said, as crooks back in the day. Some of it stems with the fact that, at a country when upward social mobility was education, at a time when we were under the Fabian socialist sort of structure, India had not opened up. The alacrity was intellectuals, apart from doctors, engineers, lawyers, go join the public service, and businessmen were sort of people who escaped the education route. Is that something that was prevalent back in the day? Like, if you the word entrepreneurship today has a buzzword to it. It's seen glamorized because you see Silicon Valley and everything else. But back then, business was sort of seen as skirting the education excellence that one had to sort of take up to and rise in whatever way you could rise in India.
So I think again you are right. 3, 4 decades ago, uh, business promoters did not place that much value on education as getting their kids into business.
Hmm.
Today, I think it's a very, very different situation. Uh, Everyone wants their children, girls and boys, to have the best education that they can afford and
Hmm.
to hopefully come back because most of this education after school is abroad, and to hopefully come back and reinvest in the country or get a job for a few years and then come back and invest in the country. So today, you will not have a business leader whose children have not gone through some degree after school or even a postgraduate degree.
Hmm.
There is very much a wantingness for them to see the world, to be exposed, to come back with best ideas, to have a network of good friends, and for your startups, who had the appetite 30 years ago to either invest in a startup or to be a startup? The risk appetite today comes from, I think, a much higher sense of self confidence as a country and as a citizen. And the
Hmm.
fact that the world is looking at us very differently than they looked at us in 47 and 91.
So obviously, India's had many, many stories. The pre-independence story, the post-independence story, and the post-liberalization story. And people forget that India is 77 years independent, but it's only a 30-odd year of a economic story, given liberalization and privatization happened in 1991. We talk about India in all these numbers and the fastest-growing economy and a G5 economy and a G3 and a G2 and a G1. But for India to achieve its full potential and there needs to be more parity in the genders, and you've touched on this in the past. How do we get to a sense of both economic freedom, economic success story, without having half the gender, which is still left behind in a lot of ways? There's still so much the gender gap to bridge. So how do we do this? Because unless we have achieved parity on the gender gap, the economic story will remain stunted.
So it is a problem. And it will continue to be a problem until we fix it. And the way to fix it is to get government and the family invested more in the girl child. Not just up to 8th standard, 10th standard, 11th standard, but to be economically and financially and emotionally invested in their success. Is
Mm,
this going to happen tomorrow? I don't think so at all. But do I see the green shoots? I see it as follows:
mm,
microfinance, primarily women, self help groups in villages. Never had
mm.
that sort of money before, however little it was. And the fact that they can put money on the table gives them a voice and the dining room.
Yeah.
The fact that they then want to invest in their girl child because the government has given direct subsidies right into their bank account
Mm,
allows them to do that rather than waste it on the middleman or alcohol.
mhm,
The fact that today, when I have clients who want me to give mentorship, I
mm,
find that they send their girls to me more than their boys, which means that they are themselves invested in their
mm.
daughters and
Yes.
want me to guide them on how to take the path forward. Today, I
Mm,
think that even the tier 2, tier 3 cities, men would like wives to have a degree, to be able to earn money, and to basically be more of an equal partner, never as equal, but more of an equal partner than they ever were before. Do I think
mm,
that men still prefer, and women still to have prefer to have a boy child than a girl child for, ticking that box? I think it's still the case.
mm,
Will that change? I don't know. But I think the problem is how to keep our women in the workforce. There is a statistic that 48% of our women in the workforce drop out. It is
mm,
called India's leaky pipeline. So
mm,
everyone who has worked, 48% of those at some stage stop working.
mm,
So that, to your point, affects the GDP, affects the parity of gender. And actually, if we brought in, as Mao says, half the sky, which is women, our economy would thrive much better. So I think the government has tried quite desperately to have programs to encourage that. But it takes
mm.
a mindset of the man in the village to
Yes.
allow that to happen, to almost accept someone as near equal, never
Mm,
equal, and to invest in the village girl child. Because
mm,
that is the 1.4 billion, right? If you're talking about India, you're not talking about just the urban population. You're talking
yeah.
about how the country as an economy can grow. And that,
Mm,
to your point, has to be the inclusion of education of the girl child and infrastructure. If you don't have infrastructure, you won't grow as an economy. So today, if the girl child can't afford to walk to school because it's too far away, if the father or mother can't afford a bicycle, if the government teachers decide that they have an annuity of a job and don't teach properly, how are you going to overcome those hurdles to get women into the workplace in the way that we want to?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, some fascinating stories there because even on microfinancing, Grameen Bank has been very successful in neighboring Bangladesh, and see companies like our members like Mastercard doing good work in financial inclusion. And uh, I wanted to get your perspective on something you mentioned about work-life balance. You mentioned that's something you struggle with, and I think Sheryl Sandberg in a book, Lean In, said she didn't believe in work-life balance. She said there's work, there's life, there's no hyphen in between. But if I may ask you, at a time when there's mental health and mental health is I'm seeing increasingly important now than they were, isn't there more of a case to be made for work-life balance to be able to bifurcate what's work, what's life, and perhaps the intersection of the two to an extent?
I'm sure there is, but I don't have that secret sauce.
Mm,
I have always suffered from not being able to find work life balance. I think there is a case to be made out for it. But, especially as a woman who's struggling in the first place, who has to do that much more to get to where the man equivalent is, there is a sacrifice. And, a lot of us have to make it.
I want to touch on some of your advice for the next generation. One of the things that you said was doing something cataclysmic as a youngster is probably the opportunity you're looking for in your next break. Is that your word of advice for posterity? Like, to take a plunge into the abyss and the unknown, and things may surprise you.
So I'm not a youngster anymore. But yes, I would always encourage somebody who is financially able to take the risk, to think
Mm,
about a moderated risk, not to, give up your life savings on an idea that hasn't got teeth behind it. But today's generation is able to take those risks much better.
mm,
Uh, as Ronnie Screwala said in his book,
mm,
there is no fear of failure. You
mm.
pick yourself up again. And today, many families have risen to a middle class status, such that if their children fail, what earlier the parents could not afford to reinvest in, today they
Yeah.
can.
Mm,
So, the upliftment of society has also allowed more risk taking.
No, absolutely. And if I may, on this point, because you've seen the change of Indian society, say even in the cricket team, because there was a time when, with the socialist era, it was a thought of conserve and save, and the thought of going to Australia and winning was brazen and unspoken. But the younger generation doesn't think that way because they were brought into a thing where the global inferiority complex that perhaps existed in the 70s and 80s didn't exist and it doesn't exist today. So it's fascinating to see that mindset change that happens. Um,
I agree.
just
I agree
yeah,
entirely.
I used to be a sports journalist, so this was very evocative for me. For young women leaders coming through, sorry, young women employees, I should say, coming through. You mentioned at a time when you were, coming through the ranks, women were shy and deferential. But how do they break the barriers today when they need also male allies to help break the glass ceiling? So what is your words of advice for young women coming through, either lawyers, non-lawyers, finding mentors, being able to break the glass ceilings, challenging themselves in ways that perhaps couldn't do it as back then?
I think it's the same words of wisdom that every generation gets, which is that, be good at your job. Don't expect favors because you're a woman. Make sure that you are always prepared and at the top of your game. Uh, Understand that ultimately today the C suite is run by men, and therefore male mentoring, if you get it, is the best type of mentoring that you can have. There is an Australian program which is called Male Champions, and that basically encourages senior male officers to mentor women
Mm,
because that's the best sort of confidence that you can build. I had a male mentor in New York. I had a male mentor when I was a barrister in Bombay. And the time and effort that they put in me was, I think, made me very much who I was as a professional. So, as a woman,
absolutely.
you should not be shy of seeking out mentorship. I think we are diffident. It's like a Venus and Mars, right?
Mhm.
We're diffident about asking what we want for. And the easier way for us is to just slip away quietly.
Yeah.
I think that's where, over time, younger women have become more confident, are willing to put their hand on the table and to ask for what is rightfully theirs. I think the village women will still take generations. But it's a journey and it has started.
To use a metaphor, it takes a village to get something done. I wanted to ask you because not everyone is blessed to have a boss like Zia Modi, but so for people who perhaps find themselves when they have unhealthy leadership in workplaces, what's your advice for younger people to be able to swim against the tide? Because it's not always easy to just get up and leave, as you mentioned with financial. Sometimes people cannot do that. What is your words of advice for how do people cope with something like that?
I think just expect the journey not to be easy. Take a deep breath when you're feeling down. Don't make
Mm,
hasty decisions. Take the weekend off. Drink some water. Meditate. And realize that you should inculcate in yourself a sense of self confidence and self worth. And understand that you are important to many people and stakeholders around you. So I think the lack of confidence is one of the things that has certainly changed from when I was a young girl. It still has a long way to go outside urban India. But I think
mm.
education is the key, right? Education brings knowledge, knowledge brings power, the mobile brings in the world, etc., etc., etc.
You advise clients of top business houses and the roster is long, but you know in a hierarchical setup, when you see many corporate houses, what would be your unsolicited advice, or maybe solicited if they've asked for you, for leadership, top level leadership, or how they can delegate and trust the next generation? Because that's tough with everything. We see that at most at homes, right? Parents and children, like being able to delegate and trust the next generation, because it's inevitable that the next generation will know things that you don't, and perhaps new processes that you don't. How can you say tell your counterparts to perhaps trust the next generation a little more and maybe let go of the reins a little bit?
It's not easy. It's, you always feel that you are going to be able to do it better than the next person.
Hmm.
Your ability to accept imperfections and mistakes is not easy because you put such a hard bar on yourself. But I think the growth has to come from understanding that there is no choice but to delegate. And that is only going to make the entire organization stronger. Mentorship during the process of delegation is key so that you just don't throw someone into the deep end in a situation where then that person, whether it's a he or she, becomes even less confident than when they started out. And to build around you a sense of trusted advisors who look out not only for the balance sheet but for your personal governance and reputation.
As we get to the business end right now of this recording, I wanted to ask, you've had plenty of success stories and your accolades are out there, and the bio data and the bio and everything speaks for itself. But if you had to say, apart from the successes, you also learn in adversity and failures, what would be those one or two lessons that you've learned, and when did those happen? The the time when things didn't go good the way
I
you wanted.
think, not to realize that saying sorry was really the honest thing to do and the quickest thing to do. To get caught up in a situation of conflict that became so difficult to unravel later on, which
Mm.
earlier could have just been resolved by a simple no thank you.
Yeah, makes sense.
To learn as you grow older that the things that are more important are the intangible ones.
Hmm.
And what you are able to spread around you as an ecosystem, which is sticky in its core values and has its own sense of attraction to the outside world. I think that has been hard, and mistakes which were made have, you know, been learned, lessons been learned very well. And I sort of make sure that I tell my war stories to as many youngsters as I can so they can learn.
Hmm.
And there's no point in projecting yourself as the best, the brightest, the greatest, never made a mistake type of organization. That's simply not true for anyone.
Yeah.
And so to learn how to be grounded despite success, and to be curious despite having domain, I think these are the things that I would say for the younger leaders.
As a journalist, former journalist, I'd say curiosity is what it is. And Steve Jobs said it best, right? Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Correct.
Um, as I come to my penultimate question, when you said saying sorry reminded me of something you said in one of your interviews. You said if there's one thing you want to change is your temper. Would that be a consensus that you still hold right now with your colleagues and your children? So I had to ask that because I wasn't sure.
I think I'm better off with my children because I see them less often. But with my colleagues, I think I would have tempered down about 30%. I think my temper surfaces but disappears as quickly, but it surfaces when someone is careless or someone hasn't thought through or someone has decided to take a shortcut. It's only on quality. Because when it comes to personalities and guiding people and mentoring people, when you point a finger at someone, as you say, the other four are pointed at you. So I'm very alive to that. But I think that the hard work that you need to put in and the
Mhm.
backbone that you need to develop as a human
Yeah.
being for yourself, I think I
Mhm.
still insist on that.
Uh, this was very interesting because I remember when you were asked the one person that you looked up to female leadership, and I can only think of this is true because you were female lawyer in New York City. So RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, bless her soul, wherever it is someone that you found inspiring. I suppose two questions. There's one, did you ever have a chance to meet her? And two is, if you had a chance to invite three dinner guests, living or dead, I assume she'd be one of them. And who would be the other two?
So I've met her on two or three occasions. She was a friend of my father's, And I was once at a dinner when she was there. My father had called me. And the next was when I had gone for a Harvard Women Lawyers reunion. And she was on a panel. And I had the great fortune of being part of that crowd and exchanging a few words with her. Ferociously bright, actually, ferociously bright. And what a story. One that fought all odds and conquered them. And, you see her pictures at her age doing her gymming and staying on the bench so that her vote could make a difference. She was just inspirational.
We've seen what her loss has meant also to the justice system here in the United States, and I can see this. People forget she was Harvard Law Review and Columbia Law Review, followed her husband as well. So I'm sure that story resonates with you very profoundly. On a final note, we've spoken about you as a daughter, but want to touch on you as a mother, and using that to segue to people watching your words of advice, be it male, women, anyone else. So, what is the how have you seen your parents parent, and how have you parented differently apart from the generational thing, maybe demeanor and approaches?
So I think I wasn't as good a mother as my mother was to me. And I think it was just time. Time was the enemy. I think I have a absolutely supremely fabulous husband who I think is by far the favorite of all my three girls between the two of us. I think I was always there when I was needed, but I probably was not enough there when it was not needed time. I hung around less than a normal mother would simply because I was at it night and day, obsessive about my profession. So,
Hmm.
could I have been a better mother? I think I could have been a better mother for sure. I
Yeah.
think today they are proud of me. I don't ask them what they thought of me when they were young.
Hmm.
I don't want to hear the answer. But I think the words of advice that I would give to any young people is, stay strong, stick to something you're passionate about. If you don't like what you're doing and you're young enough, switch. Because what will keep you going is the fact that you love what you do and that it's not merely a job. And in your journey, remember, it's easy to be honest, actually.
Hmm.
Dishonesty just becomes too complicated. And nobody believes you're really honest if they think you've been dishonest. So start with a clean slate and just carry it through. I think that, your the value system you give your children, you give your employees, you give your investors, you give the
Hmm.
ecosystem, your peers around you. You are the differentiator by who you are and not by how many millions of dollars you have, but by who you are and how. I mean, even if they're not your best buddies, people will respect you and you will have the goodwill of a larger community simply because you're willing to hold yourself to some standards, even at a cost.
Yeah. Absolutely, and love what And you mentioned about honesty at work. If I may only quip a little and do the Ernest Hemingway school of thought, maybe always tell the truth but know what to leave out. So I'm sure that's great for a lawyer as well. So no, but speaking of love, what you do, I've loved this conversation, Zia Modi. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank
I don't think 1 hour is enough of a conversation, but thank you for giving these pearls of wisdom. Almost like years and years of your both corporate and personal life, and your advice and for posterity. And I'm sure it lives on in the internet. The pleasure has been all mine. So thank you for these warm conversations on a very cold day here in Washington. Thank you.
Pleasure is mine too. Thank you so much.